Welcome, everybody, to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom for Physicians podcast. And I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Liu. And as you know, we talk about four different types of freedom: finances, time, location, and health freedom. And I'm always looking for entrepreneurs, founders, CEOs that are changing the world, startups doing fascinating things to inspire, motivate, educate you on your path towards freedom. So today is all going to be about finance. And we have Ivan Zhang. He's based out of New York City, and he's the CEO of PennyWorks, and he was a former Quant portfolio manager. So today is going to be talking all about finance, on the cutting edge of finance, DeFi, crypto, blockchain. I know these topics are kind of unpopular, out of vogue during the downturn or recession, but we're going to talk about why you should consider it moving forward. So, Ivan, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Super happy to be here.
Yeah, I know you're a busy person, and you have your company, and thanks so much for taking the time out. So tell us more about your background, your journey. It looks like you went the traditional and you went into the entrepreneurial route. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I started off as a very traditional kind of career path. Went to do schooling, with my completed my master's, and then eventually went into finance sector. And I gotta say, it wasn't a great time. So when I first joined the workforce, was trying to look for jobs. This was in December, or actually October of 2008. So you're talking about the recession we're having now, but there was a much bigger one, or potentially bigger one, in 2008 that we were facing. It was like, hey, look, the Dow, the S&P is like going down by 800 points a day. Like, what's the point? We won't have a stock market by the time we graduate. So, luckily that didn't happen. And so I graduated, went to finance. There's some interesting roles. Some of them were related to the product that we're doing now at PennyWorks, but eventually it was a fixed income portfolio management role at Bank of America, where I stayed for the better part of about 10 years. And that role is interesting because it is not a client-facing role, even though it is a very important one. It's the one where we're managing the bank's own balance sheet. And so that is a situation where when you take funds and you put in the bank and they need to go and loan them out to make money, sometimes they don't find great opportunities, right? And so it's like, well, that's a problem, right? That's a weird problem to have too much money that you don't know what to do with it. So, but it's a quite common one, especially since the financial crisis. Part of it is because of monetary policy and also some of the financial plumbing and regulations that's required. But the situation was that banks were saddled, so to speak, with excess capital that they didn't know how to deploy. And then there was this group that was responsible for generating income out of it, and that was our group. So our boss was the chief investment officer, and the main purview was to make sure that those assets and the deposits there were utilized. And we mostly invested in U.S. Treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, but it was a very large pool of money. It was like about $400 to $500 billion back then. And then now I think the current group manages something well over that, you know. Um, and part of it is just seeing kind of where the kind of money center banks, or the masters of the universe, so to speak, were operating, how they were doing things. And it was actually a eye opener, right? They use chat, they use phone. It's, I would have imagined it would be a lot more sophisticated, but that's how business is done, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's like kind of how I started on a career, and crypto came about in 2013. So I don't know exactly when you discovered it, but I think at the time, I think a lot of people that first discover it have two typical reactions, right? One is, I have no idea what this is, right? Another one, for those that are in finance or can see some kind of the linkages between technology and finance, it's a kind of appealing prospect, right? Because the analogy is internet, it moves information, right? And then the idea is that blockchain is essentially the analogous internet for money. So that gives huge practical implications because then you can build tools that can directly operate on money. And typically that was a domain that was explicitly reserved for banking institutions, right? Payment processors and things and so forth. So it has a huge opportunity to democratize finance in a way that people were just not accustomed to before.
Yeah.
Um, but it was nascent, right? In 2013, there was like nothing around. So you had to wait for the development of some of these financial applications, and that essentially came with the advent of Ethereum blockchain, which is what created the concept of smart contracts, which means that, hey, look, you have regular code that it operates on, but because the ledger is immutable, means that you can have proper accounting that essentially would be a basis for trust to have financial flows, right? And the key property here is that they've been able to create digital scarcity. Digital scarcity is a property that actually you lose from the creation of the internet, right? So it's like I have a CD, I have a music MP3, like when it first came out, people are like, oh, okay, let me send it over. But you're not really sending it over because you still have a copy of it at the end, right? And it creates a lot of headaches for people that are used to the physical world. There's some tons of benefits because the marginal cost of sending something is zero. But it also creates difficulties because the way people value goods, a lot of it is because of the relative scarcity of the item. And the moment you turn it into digital, it becomes essentially difficult to enforce. So a challenge, for example, would be digital artists, right? You have regular artists like, okay, I get it. You spent time, you drew it, and now you have a nice painting. I can sell it, I could touch it, I could feel it. But let's say I did the same effort, but I did it with a digital pen and I did use Photoshop and all that stuff. All of a sudden, I'm not able to sell my art because the moment I sell it, what is it gonna do? Just right click and save, copy and paste it, and then I don't have the art anymore, right? Or he has another copy that's just as good as mine. So actually, the blockchain technology really just brings back an original feature about physicality that wasn't in the digital universe. And that allows you to basically have a store of value and some of the other concepts that blockchain took on. So, having been dabbling in those two fields, we eventually found decentralized finance, which was the concept that, hey, look, we could just have some of these marketplaces, including exchanges, lending, and all the other financial constructs straight on the blockchain. And the nice thing is that everybody can access it. You don't need to be a broker dealer. You don't need to be a registered financial advisor. You don't need to have a particular accreditation or a third party that would say, hey, look, now you're allowed to do something, right? And the permissionless nature is basically about freedom, right? Which is kind of what you're focusing on in this podcast. Financial freedom means you're allowed to do financial activities without any third party's permission. And so when we saw the connection of this technology as well as the financial sector into something that essentially was our whole background in the last couple of decades, we just had to jump in and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to bring that value to everybody and see how broadly we can disseminate the values that blockchain technology can bring to finance.
Yeah. It's quite interesting because you see the progress and the evolution since 2012. And like I got in 2012. And you've seen it from, wild speculation, manias, the scams and hacks. And but it's like, like I said, the field is continually moving and, innovating. And, of course, you have the bad actors and the scammers, but it's purely innovation. So what's interesting is you've seen, for example, you mentioned digital art, and now these NFTs are moving from just profile pictures into ticketing, and now these are membership clubs. And so what industries do you see being disrupted by blockchain and Web3?
I mean, the applications are so huge. So there's two ways to think about it. One is how easy it is for an application to be disrupted by Web3 versus how likely it is to be disrupted, right? So the irony here is an example, traditional financial services, it's actually fairly easy to disrupt them with blockchain technology. Like, for example, if you want to create an exchange that trades all of the existing US stocks, you could do that and it wouldn't take that many lines of code, right? Because what you need to do is have a price feed for this price, for whatever stock. And then you have an exchange which just enforces, hey, look, whenever you buy, you make money when the price goes up. Whenever you sell, you lose money when the price goes up, right? And then you can create essentially a synthetic securities exchange, right? But it's not the limitation of the technology, it's the fact that you can't arbitrarily just do that without violating some securities laws in the United States, because securities exchanges are highly regulated entities, right? So this is the discrepancy that we're facing now, especially in the financial sector, is that it's actually not hard to displace in terms of technology or in terms of the efficiency or the operational excellence, but it is hard to displace the entrenched laws that were set up, partly because they were set up to protect users, simply because without this technology, the best alternative was all this regulation, testing, licensing, compliance to make sure that people were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Which you just don't have a lot of the stuff you just don't have a need to, because like, for example, an escrow account or some of these other concepts, these are all legal constructs, right? Whereas you could implement some of these in the blockchain fairly straightforward as just a little label with a number around it, right? So that's one field that has this weird discrepancy where it's very hard to displace, but very easy in terms of the technology. But there's also other fields that are kind of maybe a little bit backwards. So for example, games, right? And not even just games, but games, for example, there people used to play Counter-Strike. This was a pretty popular one. And Counter-Strike is basically a first-person shooter. So you go around with a gun and shoot people. And one thing that they came out with was an innovation is that, hey, look, now you can have customized decals on your gun. So your gun can look like a duck, but it shoots bullets, right? And had no value in terms of what you could do with the game. It doesn't give you extra boost, but like, hey, look, I have this very rare decal or skin, right? And that essentially was the first example of a not entirely decentralized, but non-fungible token, but with a traditional video game, right? Okay, so now you have this and people are paying a lot of money for it. But there's also all these other games where there's a legit economics backing it. So for example, World of Warcraft, which is basically an entire alternate universe, right? Like a fantasy. There's also equivalent ones in the sci-fi space where people have news where, hey, look, there was a huge battle that went on this server, and thousands of players went to fight each other, and they lost millions of dollars because these are like carriers or fancy ships that they spend millions of dollars of real dollars to build. And after they blow up, then obviously they're not worth anything, right?
Yeah.
But the thing about that is you get invested into the game. But what if the developer just shuts the game down? They say, hey, look, we're just not enough users playing it, so we're going to shut it down because it's not worth it for us to run the server anymore. But for you, it's something that you built your life on, right? Wouldn't it be great if you had a way to persist those assets or persist like your investment of time across to another game? Maybe it's, hey, look, now we're just going to take those assets and move it to some other theme, right? Instead of playing this like space shooter, we're going to play this like space trading game. So that's the opportunity that GameFi has in terms of being able to say, hey, look, the assets belong to you, right? The economic activity resides with you and the person that you're doing the trade for. We're just there to develop the game on top of it, which is like the activity they're doing, the theme, the focus, the quest, or whatnot, right? And that actually gives you more freedom, right? That's like it gives you more agency over those assets, so you're not locked into a particular vendor or whatever their kind of economic in-game economic policies are at the time, because maybe they need to drum up sales or something like that, right? And so that one is actually a fairly complex one because there's tons of different interactions. How many goods are there in like a regular role-playing game? There's like hundreds or thousands of these, right? And the irony is here is they're not individually very economically valuable. They're maybe worth like 5 cents or 10 cents or something like that. But over the course of an hour, you might be accumulating 50 or hundreds of these things, and there's thousands of people playing. You want them to be able to scale very, very large, right? And so that becomes a technological challenge. The modern blockchains today are struggling to fulfill that use case. So it is technologically difficult, but you can see it literally just like, logically speaking, it's already happening. They're just not NFTs yet. Being NFTs just simply brings you that agency so that you can then port it over to other platforms, give you more game financial freedom, so to speak.
Yeah. And what you're describing is sovereign, so you're owning everything, and you control everything, and it's you go to these platforms, but they don't own you. And right now Facebook and or Meta and Google, all of these control everything, so they own all your data, so you have to abide by the rules. YouTube, they can shut down your accounts. So which is interesting because this whole decentralized, everybody's going to be their own. They're going to own their own IP. Everybody's going to have a direct connection to their fans, which is going to be really great for creators and entrepreneurs. The next, you mentioned something which was really interesting, because I know you have previous experience in finance, and you mentioned DeFi. So the audience really, when you talk about they don't really understand it, but just brief general, what is DeFi, how does it work, and what sort of investment opportunities are there?
Great. So DeFi is essentially all of the financial construct that I mentioned that you can use without any permission from like a real brokerage account, right? So at the beginning, maybe in late 2018 or 19, the first DeFi constructs were collateral as lending. So how that works is that, hey, look, let's say you have some crypto. We'll just use Ethereum, for example. You have $100 of Ethereum. But you want to use that to access some funding to do something else, right? So maybe not 100. Let's say you have $100,000 of Ethereum because you need to buy a Lamborghini or something like that, right? So you would like to pledge your assets to then do something with it while still holding that exposure. And that's a very common operation that banks do, right? So they have repo, they have stock margin lending. All those things are essentially that, where you have a dead asset that's locked in, right? Or even the most analogous one for traditional finances, like a home equity line of credit, right? Your home is sitting there, is worth something, right? If you pay it off in full, and let's say the house is worth 100,000, then the money is just stuck there. But you could say, hey, look, I'm just gonna take a home equity line of credit so that I can just buy a car, right? Now people are pretty comfortable with that concept because they know that like their home is worth something, and so at some point, if the guy doesn't pay you the loan, you just take over the house, you sell it, and you get your money back, right? As long as you don't lend too much relative to the value of the assets. So that is the first DeFi construct, which is collateralized lending, and that's what we at PennyWorks focus on. Part of the reason because when you have collateralized lending on the blockchain, there's something special that happens. When you borrow against a house, and let's say the guy doesn't pay, you have to get the house, and that takes a lot of effort, right? And not just like time, but also money, and it's also a process that's difficult to do across your jurisdictions. Whereas when you have DeFi lending, the assets are on the blockchain, the exchanges are also on the blockchain, which means that you can actually call the collateral back and liquidate in real time, which reduces operational risk, reduces counterparty credit risk, which is kind of what you're doing when you're borrowing against an asset, which actually makes the whole system safer. And this is actually, if you compare that to the closest analog in traditional finance, stock margin lending, where somebody like a big financial firm is borrowing against their portfolio stocks. The problem with that is stocks are not really traded 24/7. You can't really liquidate anything on Saturday, right? You can get Jerome Powell and like Janet Yellen and the CEO of Goldman Sachs in a room, and they wouldn't be able to liquidate stock on a Saturday. It's just, there's nothing they can do. It's institutionalized, right? Whereas in the blockchain, because they trade 24/7, all the markets are on the same place, you can have atomic transactions. Atomic meaning that all of the necessary steps happen at the same time. And that's very important because if you were at a closing for a house, right, and you have your real estate lawyer A, real estate lawyer B, so on and so forth, and all the documents signed, everybody's happy, and then walking out the room, and then like somebody gets hit by a car, right? It's terrible. Like, do you have the house? It's unclear. Depends on what happens, right? And so the reason for that is because it's not atomic, right? You have all these paper, all the things are pending, but none of these things are finalized or settled. So blockchain doesn't have that. If you trade it, it's settled, it's done. And that actually dramatically reduces the risk of all the people involved. So that's the opportunity in DeFi. Now, there are additional advanced strategies that people now have. So that what I mentioned was the exchanges are also on the blockchain, which means that you can trade one asset against another. And you can also make money by being an exchange market participant. And then those things are called automated market making, so AMMs. And that is a little bit advanced. It's essentially being you are essentially taking the place of a traditional investment bank that would have served as a market maker. Again, that goes back to the theme where you have the freedom to do that. Before you had to be a broker dealer, before you have to have these licenses, before you have to have a captive audience. Now anybody that wants to participate can place some funds into these automated market making contracts, and you'll be able to generate some revenue out of that. Now, obviously, it's not risk free, so definitely you need to understand the risk. But the appeal is that you now have access, which you didn't have before. So that's kind of the budding world of decentralized finance. And as time goes over, you can imagine there's more and more financial products that are going to be built, including term deposits. So you're borrowing for a fixed amount of time, or including some volatility trading marketplaces and so on and so forth. But the irony here is that you're not disrupting or kind of replacing jobs that are at the low end of the value scale. You are disrupting the core of investment banking, right? And the core value propositions that these large institutions have. And so that's kind of essentially what the opportunity is.
Yeah, it's interesting because I haven't walked into a bank. Usually everything is mobile or digital, and if you have to go to go through the ATM, so banks are closing, and especially after 2008, people just stopped trusting them, and slowly you have a lot of DeFi startups. And there was an article I read where a lot of these DeFi startups, all the capital is going to them, and so they're basically taking away from all the banks. So it's kind of like the the banks that will survive are probably the big ones, or the ones that will innovate, the Goldmans and all of these. But in general, it's the banking industry has to change and pivot as well. So
Yeah.
this is really fascinating. I know a lot of people are interested in visiting your website, contacting you, following you. How can they do that?
Pretty straightforward. PennyWorks.com is our site. We're on LinkedIn as well. If you search for the PennyWorks company page, as well as Twitter. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn myself, pretty easily reachable if you just search for me. I'm not hiding. This is not an anonymous project. We're here to stay. And we're just trying to bring the benefits of DeFi to the broader public, right? And one interesting aspect is what we're doing, you can do yourself. So we're not saying, hey, look, this is a special sauce or something that only we have the experience of. We're just saying, hey, look, the more people that we can onboard onto the blockchain, the more benefits for the broader economy.
Yeah, and it's great to meet and connect entrepreneurs that really that are in it for the long run, and really in it for to change the world, not to make a quick buck or to scam people. And so it's great to talk to individuals such as yourself. So thanks so much, and we look forward to hearing about your future success.
Really appreciate it, Chris. Thanks a bunch.